Welcome to Fertility and Sterility on Air, the podcast where you can stay current on the latest global research in the field of reproductive medicine. This podcast brings you an overview of this month's journal, in-depth discussion with authors, and other special features. FNS On Air is brought to you by Fertility and Sterility family of journals in conjunction with the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and is hosted by Dr. Kurt Barnhart, Editor-in-Chief, Dr. Eve Feinberg, Editorial Editor, Dr. Micah Hill, Media Editor, and Dr. Pietro Bortoletto, Interactive Associate-in-Chief.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Fertility and Sterility on Air, the FNS podcast going through the table of contents for the journal. We're on volume 122, number 1, July 2024. We're joined today by Eve Feinberg, Kate Devine, and Kurt Barnhart. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Micah. We have to come up in a better order than this so we don't talk at each other like that.
Maybe by year 5, we'll figure that out and we'll get the intro down.
I think it's endearing that we're not perfect.
Kurt, we're going to dive right in. This is one of my favorite things the journal does each year, where we highlight the reviewers of the year. This year, there's 4, Katie Coyne, Hank Groen, Michael Neblett, and Sienna Nazat. And if you just want to say something about the reviewers for our listeners.
Well, I would be happy to, and I'm going to let the reviewers speak for themselves because I'm going to steal a couple quotes from what we do every year, and hopefully you read it as we ask them some standardized questions. For example, how does peer reviewing for the journal benefit your career? And Katie Coyne says, it's opened doors to me to be involved in committees and other projects related to these special interest groups. So not only is she saying she enjoys the reviewing, but it opens doors for her. We also asked people, for example, what types and trends do you see as developing as you review papers? And Hank Groen said it's definitely a trend toward more complicated analysis that have become more readily available statistical software. So he's commenting that he thinks the literature is actually better and he enjoys critiquing it. And he's one of our methodological editors. Michael Neblett says, after my submission, I also particularly like to compare my review to other reviewers to determine whether there are common themes and anything that I missed, and this has made me a better reviewer. And that was his answer to response to, what do you see as a peer reviewer? And I would comment that's a really valuable thing. You get to see your review, which is on your own, and then when it's shared, you compare yourself to the second or third reviewer, it really, really helps. And that's what we all look for as editors for the journal, to see it. And then finally, Sienna Nazat comments, what do you look for in a paper? And he says an ideal paper is one that's clear and concise and objective, supporting methodology and understanding results. I couldn't have said it any better. So these are wonderful reviewers doing a great job for the journal. I thank they and all of those participating in journal review, and thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kurt. I just want to echo what you said. Michael Neblett said, certainly one of the things I've learned the most from is by reading what other reviewers write when you're going through the. So Michael, fairly young, out of fellowship and already a reviewer of the year, as he sort of paid attention at that level. So very, very good nugget to pass on to fellows. There is some other front matter in the journal. There are a couple of practice committee documents from ASRM, including one on amenorrhea. That's very good, especially if you're a fellow or a resident. Marie Dolmans, one of the editorial editors, has written views and reviews on fibroids, and this is really quite comprehensive. It goes through the pathogenesis, our current understanding and future directions of research, clinical signs and diagnosis from adolescence to menopause, how you manage abnormal uterine bleeding, and how you manage infertility and fibroids. So a very nice set of 4 articles there to read. There is an inkling from David Seifer about SART data and the reporting of race and ethnicity in SART. And David is a former president of SART. He's also a researcher that does a lot with the SART data set. Right now, about half of the cycles in SART have accurate race and ethnicity reported, whether this is because the clinics aren't paying attention to it, or sometimes patients don't want to report it. But he just argues how hard it is to do studies looking at gaps and disparities when we don't have accurate data, when half of it's missing. And he says the goalpost should probably be Medicare data, which only has about 19% missingness. So he gives some ideas of how he thinks we could do that without driving the clinics crazy, because we know it takes a lot of effort to report to SART. So a good inkling. So we're going to dive into the science. Last month, we had 2 randomized trials. This month, we have 3. We have some pretty sophisticated prediction models, but we're going to start with the seminal contribution, and Eve's going to tell us about this, which is about validating the predictive value of a test. Eve.
Yeah, this is a great study. The title is a pilot study to investigate the clinically predictive values of copy number variations detected by next generation sequencing of cell-free DNA in spent culture media. And this was by Gary Nakuda and others from Olive Fertility in Vancouver in Sequence 46. The study was prospectively registered, and the objective was to investigate the positive predictive value and the false positive risk of copy number variations detected in cell-free DNA from spent culture media for non-viable or aneuploid embryos. The inclusion criteria were women aged 35 or younger, and that's an important nugget, at the time of oocyte retrieval who were undergoing IVF with ICSI, with an ICSI indication and a plan for single embryo transfer. They intentionally selected this young population given the relatively high risk of false positive aneuploid results in a population expected to have a lower prevalence of aneuploidy compared to an older population. They determined the target sample size of 120 based on the expectation of a 50 to 55% live birth rate per SET. If the false positive rate was 10%, then they estimated that there would be 6 or 7 sustained implantations that would have otherwise have been classified as not usable embryos. Stimulation, retrieval, ICSI, and embryo culture were carried out per usual protocols in this lab. So they did not perform assisted hatching at the cleavage stage, and embryos were cultured in individual drops of 30 microliters of media. Spent culture media was collected from day 3 onwards to day 7, and blasts meeting criteria were vitrified on days 5, 6, or 7. Culture media was sent to the reference laboratory where non-invasive PGTA was performed. They used an externally validated next-generation sequencing platform that had a sensitivity of 93% and specificity of 100%, with mean absolute percentage deviation, or MAPD, of less than 0.3 as the standard threshold for quality control. Patients then returned for FET. The best embryo was selected based on morphologic criteria and day of blastulation. PGT results were masked until the end of the first trimester, so it was a blinded study. The investigators shared the PGT results with patients, and all patients were counseled towards options for standard prenatal screening. The primary clinical interest was non-viability, and they defined this as implantation failure, miscarriage, or clinical aneuploidy. Sustained implantation was considered to be viability beyond the first trimester without aneuploidy. So the primary objective was to calculate the positive predictive value of the abnormal NGS. In other words, positive predictive value is how often someone who tests positive for the disease actually has the disease. So in this case, the disease is abnormal copy number variant, and the outcome of interest is non-implantation. So how often does an aneuploid embryo not have sustained implantation is the question. Therefore, the negative predictive value, and again, negative predictive value is when someone who tests negative doesn't have the disease. And so in this case, how an embryo without copy number variants, euploid, doesn't have non-implantation. So it was really a double negative, and basically how often an embryo that is called normal has sustained implantation. And admittedly, I thought the definitions were a little hard to wrap my head around, but hopefully that makes it clear. So let's dive in deep. They had 120 single embryo transfers. There were 75 patients, or 62.5%, who were read as no copy number variant detected. So 75 that were read as euploid, essentially. There were 36 patients, or 30%, that had an abnormal copy number variant. And then 9 patients, or 7%, failed quality control. So of that first group, 75 patients with no abnormalities detected. Of these, 43 patients had sustained implantation, 57%, which was the negative predictive value. The meat of the data are really in the 36 patients who had abnormal copy number variants. So what percentage of patients with abnormal copy number variants had non-implantation? For all of the variants combined, 15 of 36 had sustained implantation. So of those 36 that had abnormal copy number variants, 15 of them had ongoing sustained implantation. There were 21 of 36, or 80%, that didn't have sustained implantation, giving us the positive predictive value of 80%. However, when you break it down by type of abnormality, whole chromosome versus segmental versus other, the positive predictive value becomes a little bit more meaningful, especially for whole chromosome abnormalities. And you can begin to see how this testing could potentially begin to be used clinically. So 18 patients had whole chromosome copy number variants, and of these 18, only one had sustained implantation. So that's a little bit more promising. This one that had sustained implantation was actually trisomy 22 on non-invasive PGTA. And when they did an amniocentesis, they showed this to be partial tetrasomy 22. So the positive predictive value for whole chromosome aneuploidy was actually 17 of 18, or 94.4%. 4 patients had segmental or subchromosomal copy number variants, and all 4 of these had sustained implantation. 5 patients had combined whole chromosome and segmental, and of these, 4 had sustained implantation. 9 patients had chaotic abnormalities, which they defined as more than 3 whole chromosomes. And of those 9, 6 had sustained implantation. And so these bottom 3 groups, segmental, combined, and chaotic together, were called uncertain reproductive potential. And the positive predictive value for these abnormalities was very poor. Additionally, non-invasive PGTA reported unequal sex chromosome proportions, and that led to 14 misdiagnosed cases of male sex, suggesting that maternal contamination in samples was an issue, and it reinforced the inconsistency of these results. So I'm excited to talk about it, but overall, the results of this trial show that we're not quite ready to use non-invasive PGTA yet, but we are getting better at understanding the limitations and the benefits, and I think we are working towards the refinement of these clinical protocols. I'm going to open it up for discussion.
Sure, I'll stay with the obvious. I mean, the idea of having a non-invasive test is much preferred. And therefore, I mean, for lots of reasons, therefore, I mean, this is really seminal work to show how far we've gotten. And the next statement I have that's not so obvious is we haven't agreed as a field of what we're trying to test for. And, what are we trying to accomplish by this? It sounded to me like the results of, full chromosome aneuploidy is not necessarily a bad test. And I would take those results without having to biopsy an embryo. It's the complications of all the other abnormalities that we really don't know what to do with that makes this almost uninterpretable. I don't know what your guys' thoughts are on this.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the same actually, and that's why I dove really deep into the numbers. I think the crux of it is understanding those 36 embryos that were abnormal. And that's really what they were looking at, is they were looking at the positive predictive value, those embryos that are abnormal that don't have sustained implantation. And so I think if you can do a non-invasive test and you can eliminate whole chromosome abnormalities, that's a win in and of itself. I think the problem is in those uncertain reproductive potential, a lot of those also had whole chromosome abnormalities. And so that clouds it a little bit. And I think we just have to continue to refine it. I don't think it's ready to be used clinically at this point.
Did they go beyond sustained implantation to say what happened to these unsure reproductive potential embryos?
No, they didn't. And I think what was interesting, I mean, quote, good, not good for the patient, but the one whole chromosome abnormality that had sustained implantation was actually aneuploid. And so again, I think I don't want to say reassuring, but very promising that we're able to detect these abnormalities. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about the word choice. I intentionally said it was a blinded study because the investigators were blinded to the results of the non-invasive PGTA. Kurt, I want you to comment on this a little bit. They use the word non-selection, but is non-selection really a word, or is this just a blinded study?
I've had lots of conversations about investigators about this. We have seemed to have adopted, on our field, this term non-selection, and it's not an epidemiologic term. It's not in the medical literature. It's not in any other field. If you had to press me what kind of study this is a study of a diagnostic test assessing predictive value. I would call it a predictive value test. The only way you can study predictive value is to not act on the test of your diagnosis. So it's really a misnomer, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said, that this is not ready for prime time. That said, I am very glad they did this diagnostic accuracy or predictive value test. And as you said, Kurt, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the positive predictive value of the whole chromosome aneuploidy. Obviously, it's a very small sample of whole chromosome aneuploidies that were detected in the cell-free DNA, but I actually have optimism for the future of non-invasive PGT based on this study, even though I would certainly recommend exercising extreme caution in terms of clinical use at this point.
Yeah, and I want to highlight the negative predictive value also. I mean, the embryos that were called aneuploid did quite well, and I think very consistent with what we see clinically with traditional PGTA. So I think, again, we're getting there. And I agree. I read this and I have a lot of optimism about what the future holds for this technology. And I think that further refinement of the protocols, I'm not sure at what point. They didn't do assisted hatching as they had done in some previous trials, where they concurrently did PGTA, and perhaps that might have helped to increase the accuracy by not breaching the zona. I don't know exactly which ways to refine the protocols, but I think we're getting there, and I can start to see a future where this is really going to take off.
I heard you say aneuploid there, and I think you meant euploid. The euploid embryos that were called had pretty good sustained implantation. And the only reason I bring that up, I'm sure our listeners would have figured that out, is that that's really important to me, right? We want to know what the sustained implantation rate is a normal embryo is without a biopsy, because we're arguing a lot about how much the biopsy affects an embryo. So that's one way of getting at it. So the reason I wanted to correct that, right?
So that was 57%. So 75% of patients who had no abnormalities detected, of those 43 had sustained implantation. So it's promising.
And that would be, I guess, if we're looking at PGT studies, that would be compared to maybe 75% of PGT biopsied euploid embryos. Would that be right? So it is a little bit lower, but it's pretty close to what we would expect the ceiling of sustained implantation to be, that negative predictive value.
I don't think that's right, Mike. I think the sustained implantation of a biopsied embryo is in that range. I don't think it's 60 and 70%.
Yeah,
I'd say 55 to 60, probably closer to 60.
So it's at the lower end of that range, so pretty close.
Or in the range, right? And this all depends on numbers and confidence intervals and things like that. But it didn't strike me as being particularly different.
Okay, interesting. Great, thank you, Eve. So the next study is moving on to andrology, and this is one that I have. It's called The Impact of Microfluidic Sperm Processing on Blastocyst Euploidy Rates Compared with Density Gradient Centrifugation, a Sibling oocyte, double-blinded, prospective randomized trial. This is out of the University of Connecticut. First author is Gadawala, and senior author is Lawrence Engman. So we know that there is some data to suggest that using microfluidics, in this case, they're talking about Zymot, if we're talking about the specific product, but using microfluidics for sperm selection. And the idea is that allowing sperm to sort of progress through this microfluidic device and through a filter will help select for more motile sperm, maybe more morphologically normal sperm, but it also has been shown to lower DNA fragmentation. And the thought is that perhaps the centrifugation for traditional sperm prep induce reactive oxygen species and induce, as part of the sperm prep, some level of DNA fragmentation. And so there is some evidence that you might get better fertilization or better blastocyst development by using microfluidics. And this has not, though, been put through sort of a sibling oocyte design. So they tested the hypothesis that blastocyst euploidy rates would be higher in microfluidic sperm processing group compared to the control group. And again, this is a sibling oocyte study. So they're taking each patient and randomizing half of their sperm to one prep, half to the other. Half the eggs get one of those preps and half the eggs get the other. So essentially each patient is serving as their own control. They had very broad inclusion criteria. So this was any IVF patient age 18 to 42. They needed to have between 8 and 30 eggs so that they would have enough to randomize into each of the sibling cohorts. The main exclusion criteria was severe male factor. So if they had less than 5 million in sperm, they were excluded from this study. So this is essentially a broad all-comer IVF study. So they ended up with 106 patients. And of those 106 patients, they had about 1,400 eggs that were randomized. And I should point out that they choose to analyze their data on a per oocyte basis as opposed to a per patient basis. So they're really increasing their power, if you want to say that's the advantage of what they did, to have 1,400 units to analyze as opposed to the 106 patients. So overall, when they looked at their primary outcome of euploidy, if you looked at it on an average per mature oocyte, it was 20% versus 22%. If you looked at it on a per blastocyst that was biopsied, it was 46% versus 53%. None of those were statistically different. If you looked at high quality blasts or total number of blasts, those numbers were also the same, 2.8 blasts versus 2.5 blasts. The only thing that was statistically significant was the difference in fertilization. Fertilization was 70% of oocytes, mature oocytes, in the control group versus 76% in the microfluidic group. And this was a p-value of 0.3. This is why I brought up at the start that they chose to analyze their data on a per egg basis instead of a per patient basis. So if you analyze this on a per patient basis, that 6% difference would not be anywhere close to statistically significant. But because there's sort of this false increase, I'll use that word, but we can debate that, in power by doing it per egg, you get a much lower p-value. It's easier to find statistical significance. Some people might argue that those eggs from each patient aren't independent observations. They're obviously connected to each other, and can just a paired t-test fix that? There might have been other ways you could go about it. But overall, a null study, except for this 6% difference in fertilization. So there was slightly higher. Now, if you were to sort of take a sibling oocyte as a proof of concept that, this did not pass that proof of concept that it has an effect on euploidy rate, it does on fertilization. Now, if you're going to power this to randomize patients instead of eggs, and you're talking about 6% increase in fertilization, that'd be one more 2PN for every 17 M2s that you get. You'd probably need 10,000 patients or something ridiculous to power that for an outcome other than fertilization to say that that actually might improve live birth or cumulative live birth. So overall, a nice study with the inherent limitations of a sibling oocyte study, and it did not support the concept that Zymot might help you get more blasts or better quality blasts. Thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was good. A lot of centers have adopted the use of Zymot. We have a center down the street that charges extra for patients to use Zymot. And I often see these patients as a second opinion and have said that until we see data actually showing improvements in clinical outcome, I wouldn't jump on that bandwagon. The one thing I want to highlight that might be interpretable from this study is that it's not inferior. And so if it's an easier way of processing sperm, then I think we can potentially use it for that indication. And the authors make some stretch to this might be the first step in automation in the IVF laboratory. It's a small step that might improve processing time, but it's certainly not something that I would recommend for improving outcomes.
I totally agree with that. And I loved your analysis, Mike, of the per patient basis, because I think that's really, really important in terms of interpreting these data. The one bone I would kind of throw to Zymot in terms of this study design and where it may potentially have benefit, and I'm not saying it does, I'm just saying we don't know based on this study, is in those patients, those couples for whom the male partner does have an elevated DNA fragmentation index. Of course, that's a huge can of worms. That said, to my knowledge, the only thing that Zymot has been shown to do is to produce a sample on the other side of the microfluidic chamber that has a lower DFI than that introduced to the device initially. And so to the extent that that has clinical benefit, and we don't even know that, I would think that that is the population that we'd be wanting to study.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because does ICSI overcome that DNA fragmentation benefit that you might get? And so I think that's really theoretical, that you are going to improve the DNA fragmentation on a single sperm basis when we have the ability to then select the best sperm for ICSI. And so you're not fundamentally changing the sample, you're potentially changing the proportion of good sperm in that sample. And so I think it becomes less relevant when you talk about ICSI.
It's a good point.
All right, great article. So, Kurt, we're moving on to one of the first of the two prediction studies using machine learning that we're going to talk about. I'm glad that you're going first so you can teach us all what that is before I present my article in a little bit. So tell us about yours.
I suspected you might want to make me go first on this one. So the article I'm reviewing, I really enjoyed. It's called Prediction of Pregnancy-Related Complications in Women Undergoing Assisted Reproduction Using Machine Learning Models. It's from first author Chen Wang and senior author Anna Oberg, and it's out of the Karolinska Institute, and it uses the envious Swedish database of all children conceived with IVF. And the idea is that they wanted to take a large amount of data and see if they could use these machine learning prediction algorithms to say, can we predict pregnancy complications in women conceived with ART? They define pregnancy complications as preeclampsia, pregnancy complications, which they included previa, and abruption in one group, and postpartum hemorrhage. The idea of the study is a little bit different than we see in the journal often. The goal for the study really was to say, if we can predict upfront who is at risk for these pregnancy complications, we can have better preparedness, we could understand it, we could monitor different. And if we really believe that there are greater risk of pregnancy complications, we can be ready for it. So can we find out who is going to fit in that profile? They looked at two groups of predictors, just a woman itself, where does she live, her age, her BMI, things like that. And then in the second models, they looked at some of the parameters of IVF that might have contributed to it. So really relatively simple question using a large database. So let me give you a little background in the Swedish population, just to give you some context. So it really is kind of a microcosm in this population where they looked at more than 14,000 women over a period of 2008 to 2016. So I don't want to get hung up that this is not the most contemporary data set, but it gives an idea. For example, the incidence of preeclampsia was 5.5%, which is a little bit lower than I see in my practice. The incidence of placenta abnormality was around 4%, 3.8%. Again, I still think might be lower than some literature has reported. And postpartum hemorrhage was a little higher at 6.9, which struck me as being high, but that might be a definitional thing. And what they found ultimately using these multiple machine learning algorithms, and let me state them now, and I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. They looked at logistic regression, decision tree modeling, naive Bayes classification, support vector machine learning, random forest, gradient boosting, and they looked at each one of these models to predict whether you could say this woman is at risk for those outcomes. The short answer about the paper was that all of these models, using the C statistic, which is essentially the mathematical equivalent of the area under the curve, was moderate or bad at best. They were basically saying they could predict at 57 to 60%, or the C statistic was 57 to 67, which is not very good. I mean, 50. If the C statistic is 0.5 or 50, it's a coin flip. It's random. So the outline of this paper basically says we can do better, or we should be able to do better at assessing these outcomes with perhaps longitudinal data. There's some colleagues I have at Penn here, they're looking at it's the change in blood pressure or markers of things. It's something during the pregnancy that can predict preeclampsia, not just what's your BMI or where you live or your age. So there's some prediction value to that, but not really all that great. By the way, they did note that fresh versus frozen transfer made a difference, which so it does at least confirm that aspect. So the question you're asking me is, why the heck do we want to use machine learning, and what is machine learning? So let me see if I can give you guys a quick primer. Machine learning essentially is really not all that different than a computer model. we all use computer models in our research. The most common model we use is logistic regression. We're relatively comfortable with the outcome of that. But these other models are basically looking at the data, or what's called a feature, in a slightly different way to see if they can use the information of a feature to partition or put people in different groups and what their prediction is. So essentially, they all give you relatively the same outcome, which is why in this particular study, they all actually performed very, very similar. It wasn't, that's another take-home message of this, that one of these mathematical algorithms that you're hearing now didn't outperform the other ones. In fact, they suggest that logistic regression, which is the one we're most used to, might be the most valuable. Again, one of the reasons I wanted to publish this paper. So let's go through the primer. What is logistic regression? So logistic regression basically, by definition, says I'm going to put a variable or a prediction into two categories, yes or no. It's binary. And it basically looks at the probability of this. It looks at the particular variable and says, is it above or below 50%? Or it gives a logistic number. And if that number is greater than 0.5, it says that's positive. And if it's below 0.5, it says it's negative. So it's basically predicting just on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0.1 to 1, basically saying, how strong is that related? For example, if you're predicting whether an email is spam or not, logistic regression calculates the probability of it being spam on features like keywords. Each keyword, it'll say that's a 0.8 or that's a 0.2, and it puts them all together, accounting for the other ones, and eventually comes up with a prediction. So it really is ultimately saying, yes, it's spam, no, it's not. And in the case of preeclampsia, it didn't do a very good job. Really couldn't tell the difference all that much. So what are the other ones and how they work? In my research, I use decision tree a lot. Decision tree works pretty well because it doesn't just give a 0 to 1 probability. It actually looks at the different features differently. Best example I had talking to my statistical friends is, what if you want to find out if a firefly is male or female? So you look at all the characteristics you can about this group of fireflies, and maybe the ones that fly the highest are mostly male, and the ones that find the lowest are mostly female. Now, you didn't get it perfect, but you've got a group that kind of starts to differentiate it. So now you look at the high flyers, you say, well, now let's look at wing size. Maybe the wing sizes are the ones with larger wings are men, and they also were flying high. Then you might look at body type, and only the ones that have flying high, only the ones that had a large body type also had high wings. Now you're getting closer and closer and closer to saying that firefly is a male, and the other one. So it's basically putting them through each decision. This one's pretty predictive, but I can get more predictive in that group conditional on the first one. Then I can get even more predictive in the third group conditional on the first two. Problem with that is it can be sometimes nonsensical because you can come up with predictions that are just weird. Decision tree is one thing that people use a lot. Random forest is basically a model of decision trees. It does that 1,000 times. And it says, wait, this group of 1,000 predictions did pretty well, whereas that group of 1,000 predictions didn't do so well. So let's pick this random forest. Each forest has one tree, which is a decision, but it's not just one decision, it's 1,000 decisions. So theoretically, that will give you more precision, but it has a problem with, I don't know what to do with the missing data. I don't know what to do if it's a very small sample size because I'm making up nonsensical trees. So those I understand a little bit. The other ones are a little harder. The naive Bayes is basically, let's go back to the email thing. It assumes that the presence of a certain feature is completely independent of another. So it's not, it looks at one word and it's not looking at the word next to it. It says every feature is independent. And that might work very well in some cases where you can assume independence of those things. It's really random variables, but it doesn't work so well in infertility when things like embryo transfer are very related to the estrogen level and things like that. That might have been a bad example, but you understand what I'm saying. So the advantage of the naive Bayes, and the key word to remember naive, is that everything is independent and not linked, where the others would come out with better. Gradient boosting is the best example I heard is that imagine you're trying to solve a puzzle. The first person comes in, focuses on one aspect of it, does a pretty bad job of finding the puzzle, but it gets some progress. The next person comes in and says, I'm going to take what you learned and I'm going to add mine on top of it. And then the third person come in, I'm going to learn what from you guys two did, and I'm going to build on top of that mathematically. So you're basically boosting up what the first attempt was with the second attempt, and then boosting up the second attempt with the third attempt with the first and the second. And there's advantages to that or not. And kind of my favorite one is the support vectors. And support vectors are really more like geography. A vector is a line between two things. What this is trying to draw a line between classification. Imagine that, well, my fireflies are flying. You want to draw a line that's sometimes crooked that says I'm separating the boys from the girls. And it looks at a specific feature and says, well, where does that line go? The feature goes to the right, the line deviates to the right. If the feature goes to the left, it goes to the left. So it's really making a very crooked line based on all these features. And if one of the features changes, it changes the direction of the line. But all of these are saying the same thing. How do I just separate group A into group B? And they're all basically using different types of mathematical permutations that learn or that inform each other, hence the machine learning. So it's kind of an artificial intelligence. It's just making different assumptions about the data. So I hope that was mildly clear, because the point is, don't get overwhelmed by these terms. There are very specific conditions when one model might be better than another. Size of the data field, missing data, independence of the data, but that's what your statistician is going to help you with. The take-home message here is they all use similar logic and generally get you to the same point. And in this case, it told us the simplest method was the best. And unfortunately, the prediction wasn't all that great. So a good learning tool, but maybe not the best material to talk about. So the bottom line is we can't yet predict who's going to have preeclampsia very well, but our models going forward probably can use many of these methods to explore, and there might be some specific details of why one method is working than another, but all of them shouldn't intimidate you. They're all just the same kind of idea. They're basically saying, how do I put persons or features into each bucket? And then is that classification correct or not? How is that, Mike? Is that helping you or hurting you?
Oh, that was awesome, because my paper uses every single one of those. So that's great. But I like how you break it down, because I know reviewers and editors, we're struggling with all these AI and machine learning papers. And I think how you broke it down into this is what the test is trying to do, and these are just different ways we can do it. Keep it simple in the way that you normally would think about any question. And did they choose the right test to try to answer it? But the different ways of getting there.
Yeah, I wouldn't be intimidated by which test they use, but I would use the same review criteria that I just told you, logistic regression prediction, that you use. What did you put in your logistic regression? You need to tell me the features that you're using to predict. That should be in every paper, no matter what mathematical model you use. And you should have some measure of how strong that predictor is. That's intuitive to us. And then there should be some model of precision around it. Like, how many times did you do it, and what's the confidence interval? So those three things should be in every machine learning paper that you're looking. You should look at what is driving the prediction? Is it logical? And then ultimately the same statistic we use all the day, how precise is your answer?
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic, Kurt. Thank you for the lesson. I actually learned a lot. I think where I struggle with this, and Micah, with the paper that you're going to talk about for miscarriage, is we don't really understand causation. And so I think it's very hard to predict which patients are going to have preeclampsia if we don't really understand what causes preeclampsia. We don't really understand the pathophysiology of the disease. And it remains more of a mystery, even with lots of tools to say we can't even predict who gets the disease that we don't understand.
Yeah, Eve, it goes back to what all of us shouldn't have been surprised that BMI was the strongest predictor here, that the higher BMI was a greater risk for preeclampsia. We all know that that's an odds ratio. We've seen that in many papers. The problem is it's not so strongly associated, and the outcome is still so rare that if you look at everybody, it's just not a very good predictor. Most people that are obese don't get preeclampsia, and you still get people that are thin that do get preeclampsia. That's why it's a known risk factor. It's not a very good predictor. That's the difference that we're trying to get across.
Right. But I still think that in order to, and I guess maybe you work backwards, right? You learn about what the risk factors are for a disease by doing these studies. But I just feel like preeclampsia is so unknown in terms of what is the exact pathophysiology of it, who gets it, and how likely is it that somebody will get preeclampsia. And I think that a large study like this only intensifies the question of unknown, that like we really can't predict it because I don't think we don't know the risk factors and we don't know what causes it.
Yeah, I applaud these authors, though. I mean, I think they did a very nice job in terms of laying out their methods and trying to look at everything and not sort of calling upon this like black box of AI and machine learning that we see so often. And I love the way you explained it, Kurt. I also learned a ton, and I like that, even if it's AI or machine learning, we need to be able to look in the black box and really understand what is being modeled to get the predictions. And so even though this was in a way a negative study, I think it helped us understand all what you've just said, that we don't really understand what causes some of these outcomes, but it did it, I thought, in a pretty elegant way.
Very well said. So this is, again, just a reminder to like and subscribe to the Fertility and Sterility on-air podcasts, all of them in our suite each month, to get great educational stuff like we all just heard from Kurt. Kate, we're moving on to you now. You actually get 2 RCTs today. You're very lucky. Tell us about the ALADDIN trial.
Yeah, I felt very lucky to get 2 out of the 3 RCTs. That was my line. You stole it. But at any rate, I really, really love the study. So it was entitled The Effect of Laser-Assisted Hatching on Vitrified Warm Blastocysts, the ALADDIN Randomized Controlled Trial, with first author Altieri. So this was an RCT evaluating live birth following vitrified warm single blast transfer at 2 Italian centers. And the exposure, the intervention is without versus with laser diode assisted hatching post-warming. And so randomization was performed at warming, and they were powered to detect a 10% difference in live birth. They found no significant difference in either this primary outcome or in the secondary outcomes of clinical pregnancy, miscarriage, multiple pregnancies. So here it's relevant that it was single embryo transfer. So they were talking about monozygotic twinning, which has been hypothesized to be associated with assisted hatching. They also looked at the secondary outcomes of preterm birth, obstetrical or early neonatal complications, or congenital abnormalities. And of course, it's important to acknowledge that they were not powered to assess any of these secondary outcomes. Importantly, PGT or embryo biopsy was an exclusion. That's important both in terms of the generalizability of these data to U.S. practice, and also important in terms of, the biologic plausibility of how assisted hatching may or may not improve outcomes, since the zone is also breached in the setting of PGT. They went on to evaluate the impact of the intervention as well within subgroups, and they found no difference in live birth in any of the subgroups. And the subgroup analyses were also quite helpful insofar as it's been hypothesized that some of these subgroups may benefit from assisted hatching. And again, they found no difference. So the subgroups that they evaluated were whether the 2 centers that performed the frozen embryo transfer had differential success rates. They looked at age above versus below 38 years old, although it's important to note that patients older than 39 were excluded. So the older group represented only about a quarter of the total population. And again, in some of our practice committee documents, historically 38 was offered as potentially a threshold where one might consider using assisted hatching. They also looked at top quality versus poor or fair quality blastocysts, day of vitrification, and unexplained versus other infertility diagnoses. Again, finding that there was no particular group among these subgroups that benefited from the assisted hatching in terms of live birth. So overall, as I stated, I think this was an excellent study, and it adds on, pun intended, to the ongoing conversation about the appropriate validation and use of add-ons. So other than a couple of minor quibbles, which I'll mention, and this is a theme that we discussed last month as well, is the appropriateness of presenting p-values for demographic data in an RCT, which these authors did and probably advise against. Also, I may have adjusted their inclusion and exclusion criteria a little bit. It's unclear to me why, when it's a mixed population of conventional and ICSI, that severe male factor needed to be excluded. given that when looking at their consort diagram, there were 2 subjects for whom there were randomization errors, and they did not go on to recruit and randomize 2 additional subjects to do that. And then I probably would have advocated for excluding blastocysts from vitrified eggs, especially since it could be confounding. And also there were only 2 subjects. So would rather have just left it clean and left those out and randomized 2 additional patients. Also their power may have been slightly impacted by the overestimate of the expected live birth in the hatching group in their initial sample size calculation. And then lastly, the exclusion of the older, higher BMI patients and the overall thinness of their population who had a mean BMI of 21 may limit the generalizability to our US practice and US population. But to get to sort of the meat of this paper, which again is excellent and highly clinically useful, the use of assisted hatching following vitrification and warming has been largely based on an assumption. And that assumption being that zona hardening owing to vitrification could have a negative impact on the blastocyst's ability to hatch and implant. And this study suggests that this is likely not the case. It's an interesting question raised and well discussed by the authors in their conclusion that all of these blastocysts were collapsed pre-vitrification. So they describe this as laser artificial shrinkage during the vitrification procedure, creating a small hole at the cellular junctions of the trophectoderm before vitrification. And so, could this really level the playing field? Could this be sort of micro hatching in and of itself? And maybe doing this enables, implantation irrespective of whether the hatching is then done post-warming. That said, I don't think it in any way invalidates their results. My understanding, we certainly do collapse our blastocysts prior to vitrification, and that is fairly standard across all of the clinics that I've ever worked in. And so, I'm interested to hear, number one, what's being done at all of your centers. We are, as I said, shrinking or collapsing prior to vitrification. We are no longer hatching post-warming, and that's based on having been convinced on actually lesser quality evidence than this in the literature and based on our own internal data. And then one other question that I have is, do we need to replicate this? I mean, obviously, I mentioned that it was a specific population of no PGT vitrified warmed transfer. And so it begs the question of, can we extrapolate these data to PGT populations, fresh transfer, older patients, since it was a minority of their patient population, blastocysts from frozen oocytes? Do we need to do an RCT for all of these various types of practice? And so, for these add-ons, and Micah, this is a conversation we were having at NIH Journal Club this week, on whose side should the burden of proof fall, right? This was based on an assumption. And so, do we need to be doing RCT after RCT after RCT to prove that something that was sort of arbitrarily performed based on an assumption doesn't work? There's a quote that's been ascribed to the White Rabbit and Alice in Wonderland, as well as Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well as Elvis Presley. That's, don't just do something, stand there. And that's pretty hard to do, but sometimes it's the right thing.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic. And I really enjoyed your quote. So our lab does still hatch. I will say that we were late adapters to hatching on warming. I think we started to do that about a year ago when we looked at our internal data of those that we had a few that were hatched and then a few that weren't hatched, and looked back systematically at our own data and saw about a 5% higher ongoing pregnancy rate in those FETs that we did hatch. And so we routinely hatch all of our warmed blastocysts. And so now the question is, what do we do now? Do we take this one RCT in a different center with different protocols and say, well, it doesn't show a difference, therefore we're going to change our protocol? Or do we continue to do what we do, knowing that we looked at our own internal data, saw improvement, and carry on as we carry on? I don't know the right answer there.
I would say this is pretty high quality data. I would, of course, proceed with caution and track how your outcomes look. But I do think that this warrants a change.
I'll jump in, Kate. Speaking like an editor, I'm really pleased that this got published because although there's some major interventions in our field that were accidental, I just heard the story of ICSI that I don't remember where I was, but someone giving the anecdote where they really didn't expect to put the sperm into the cytoplasm. That was an accident. And they went back afterwards to publish that because they found that it worked. You don't need an RCT to show that ICSI works in male factor, but a lot of our embryology has really been, I don't know, paternalistic. Like, I think this is the right thing to do. So I really encourage that we do so have some evidence base behind some of the decisions that we make. So I'm really encouraged that people would go out and do this trial and maybe make these incremental changes that might differ. It's kind of been the Wild West. Each laboratory does what they think is best, but we really don't know what they think. And then there's usually multiple decisions. So if you can isolate one in an RCT, I applaud that. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I agree with that, Kurt. I think in some ways we would like to see the RCT first before it's widely clinically implemented across the country. And I think that's part of what Kate's point was. But if these things have happened without those RCTs being done, then yeah, we do need them. And this is a great example of that. Eve, we're moving on to you now. This is a paper from our media editor from FNS Reviews, Blake Evans. Tell us about Blake's paper.
Not just Blake's paper, but you're an author and Kate is senior author. So this is a pleasure to discuss this with both of you. And I look forward to some similar lessons on GEEs. So this was a retrospective. The title of this study is Assessment of Clinical Pregnancies in Up to 8 Ovarian Stimulation with IUI Cycles in Those Unable to Proceed with In Vitro Fertilization. This was a retrospective cohort study of over 18,000 patients, and the objective was to study the clinical pregnancy rate per ovarian stimulation with IUI in patients with repetitive cycles up to a maximum of 8 IUI cycles. So a total of 37,000 consecutive OS IUI cycles from 2002 to 2019 were evaluated, with the goal of limiting the analysis to those who largely had unexplained infertility. Those with anovulatory diagnoses, tubal factor, male factor, those using donor sperm, and those with canceled cycles and missing data were excluded. And so the final number was about 18,000 patients. Ovarian stimulation protocols included Clomid, letrozole, injectable gonadotropins, and trigger was administered with HCG, and IUI was performed 36 to 42 hours post-trigger or on the day after an LH surge was detected. Clinical pregnancy rate was the primary outcome, and that was analyzed using generalized estimating equations controlling for age, stimulation protocol, and BMI. Cycle number was evaluated as a set of categorical indicator variables, and cycle 1 was considered to be the reference cycle. The mean cumulative pregnancy rate per number of consecutive completed IUI cycles was calculated with the assumption that all patients would continue up to 8 IUI cycles without discontinuation. Patients aged less than 35 were about half of the cohort, 48%, and oral agents were used alone in 34% of cycles. 46% used injectable gonadotropins in combination with oral agents, and 19% of cycles used gonadotropins alone. I found that a little surprising too. I also found the results surprising. So the predicted probability of clinical pregnancy in cycles 1 through 8 remained stable at 14.8% to 16.7%. With cycle 1 as the reference cycle, pregnancy rate in cycles 2 to 4 were only ever so slightly lower, 1.7%. And I think most surprising was that the mean predicted probability of pregnancy for cycles 5 through 8 was actually not significantly different compared to that first cycle. Modeling indicated that proceeding through up to 8 cycles would result in cumulative pregnancy rate of 74%. I do think, though, it's worth noting that only 12% of patients in this study pursued IUI beyond the 4th cycle, and only 1% actually completed 8 cycles. The last important point is that the multiple rate was very low, especially considering the use of gonadotropins both in combination and alone. And it was 0.8% per treatment cycle, or 4.9% of all pregnancies. And so I think the big question is, how do we use these data? Do we change gears, and instead of doing 3 cycles of IUI and moving on to IVF, do we encourage more cycles? I don't know that that's the right answer for patients. But I do think that it can potentially be presented as an option in patients who don't want to or can't move forward with IVF. And so I think the data are very reassuring in that situation of inability to access IVF or those who may have ethical issues. But what I worry about is I don't want these data to drive our field backwards towards insurance companies mandating 6 or even 8 IUI cycles prior to allowing for IVF to be approved. Kate, Mike, I'd love to hear from both of you in terms of just some of the nitty gritty with the study in terms of methodology and just your take home points from it. But I think it's really important and very well done. So congratulations to Blake and to both of you.
Thanks, Eve. I think your interpretation is spot on. Our really thought process in asking this question was not so much as to, is 8 cycles the right number of cycles for patients to do before transitioning to IUI? Some would say that that's, inhumane to subject patients to 8 rounds of stimulated monitored IUIs before offering another more effective treatment option. And without question, IVF is that. That said, we all have patients who can't afford IVF or have moral or ethical, misgivings about IVF, or just about the really invasiveness of the procedure. And so I do think that these data were reassuring to me that we should not, quote unquote, give up on these patients and just say, come back when you've saved enough money or something like that. But your point about resource utilization and insurance reimbursement is extremely well taken. If there's any, payers out there listening, please don't make us do 8 IUIs before authorizing IVF. And yes, everything you mentioned about the stability across 8 cycles and about the low multiple rate were somewhat surprising to us as well, although we were pleased to have found that, and again, it just gives hope to some of our patients who, for various reasons, are not able to move to IVF.
I looked at it in a slightly different way, maybe because I remember growing up, how many IUI should you do, which is, when are there diminishing returns? I've heard a lot of colleagues say, if you haven't gotten pregnant in your 3rd, it's not worth going on. It's different than an insurance mandate, of course. But I've always been curious, can IUIs be a quote unquote diagnostic test, or the theme of the day, a predictor? So it seems to me that this data has shown that, again, in somebody with unexplained infertility, IUI seem to be relatively independent, at least for a number of cycles, that there isn't a point where you can say, if you haven't conceived by now, you won't, or probability goes way down. So,
yeah, one of my favorite studies was by Noth, Gnoth, and others, that looked at the time to conception. And this was a large study, and I don't want to quote it exactly because I'm afraid I'm going to misquote it. But basically in that study, they followed couples who were attempting conception for the first time coming off birth control, and they looked at the likelihood of conception per cycle. And the highest likelihood of conception was really in the first 4 cycles. It was 67%. And after that point, there were diminishing returns. And especially going from 6 to 12 months, there was very little improvement. And so what I think is really interesting about this study is that we didn't see that. We didn't see the highest likelihood of success really within the first 4 cycles. And we didn't see the highest likelihood of success in that cycle 1 or the reference cycle. And when we compared the subsequent cycles to that reference cycle, there weren't differences. And so I just can't quite wrap my head around why that's different, but it may be something with likelihood of conception without medical assistance versus with medical assistance. And the playing field may be a little bit more level in that second scenario.
Yeah, that would be my guess, Eve, as to why these data showed that difference. Because I expected it to show what you're describing, that it would mimic natural fertility or unassisted fertility, that it would mimic those rates. But it must be something about the treatment that is effective that's leveling that, at least through those first 8 months.
Permit me to be wildly speculative here. I hope that this trend that we're describing here with IUIs, people will accept for IVF too. We might therefore talk about this recurrent implantation failure concept. Just because somebody fails one IVF cycle doesn't mean it failed, that sometimes you need to do something more than once. So I know I'm going from IUIs to IVF, but this concept is not unusual. People can get pregnant on their second or third or fourth try.
There was a JAMA study that said that IVF up to 8 cycles maintained efficacy. So I really feel like that holds true for both. And I always tell my patients, I say, we don't cure cancer with one cycle of chemotherapy. It's really that cumulative likelihood of success. You give multiple rounds. And I'm certain that there probably are patients who are cured after one cycle of chemotherapy, but we often don't stop there. Same with antibiotics. We don't give one pill, we give a course of treatment. And so I like to lay it out at the very beginning when I talk to a couple about what are some realistic expectations, that this is a cumulative likelihood of success in an iterative process. And we often have multiple cycles in order to achieve our desired final outcome. Kate, can you geek out on us a little bit and just talk about a GEE?
Yeah, I mean, it's another model, just as, Kurt was going through models, and it's important to kind of understand what we're modeling for. And so this was a particularly complex scenario and we had a lot of conversations about the fact that, we could be over adjusting here insofar as the exposure is actually the number of cycles that we're doing, right? And so since we're often in a GEE model adjusting for multiple cycles in the same subject or in the same patient, to include that in the model and adjust for it with a GEE, again, could be actually adjusting for the exposure itself. So I'll let Micah chime in too a little bit, because he's the statistical mastermind, and especially insofar as really an expert on GE in this particular methodology. But I just wanted to highlight that, whereas GE is a way to adjust for, potential confounders, in this particular study, it actually was more of a complex decision than typically.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. That paragraph that explained it was kind of like a foreign language.
I actually learned about GEEs from reviewers of FNS. This is when we were presenting data on elevated progesterone in the luteal phase of IVF cycles, or just before HCG trigger being negative for outcomes. And a reviewer said, you have patients and they have multiple transfers and multiple retrievals and cycles. That's not independent observation. So your logistic regression isn't adequate. So that's the main thing we use it for, is for linear and logistic adjustments when we have patients that contribute multiple times where they're not independent observations. But as Kate said in this one, maybe, we had to be very careful with how we use that.
It was well said, Micah. I think that was what I was going to say too. It's the idea that you've got people contributing multiple data, and that's not an assumption, independent assumption.
All right, Kate, we are on to our final RCT in the journal for July.
Yeah, so this study is, again, very lucky to get yet a second RCT, was entitled Intravaginal Exposure to Seminal Plasma After Ovum Pickup Does Not Increase Live Birth Rates After IVF or ICSI, a double-blind placebo-controlled randomized trial. And this is from Liffner et al. Out of Sweden. This is yet another well-designed, well-powered RCT. This one was double-blind and placebo-controlled. And it evaluated the impact of the biologically plausible intervention of the deposition of seminal plasma into the vagina at the time of oocyte pickup, and the impact of this intervention on live birth, where fresh transfer was planned. So basically, the authors had patients who were planning to do a fresh embryo transfer have their partner's semen, so 0.5 to 1 cc of plasma prepared using a 2-step continuous colloid gradient separation, deposited into the vagina after the eggs were retrieved. And then in the control group, saline was used as a placebo control. And then they evaluated the probability of live birth, or the likelihood of live birth in each group. This was, as I said, based on an abundance actually of data on this question of whether exposure to seminal plasma or semen in general may improve the probability of success in ART. And so 2 prior meta-analyses had shown a small but statistically significant improvement in outcomes when the woman was exposed to seminal plasma. And the proposed mechanism is the presence of interferons and interleukins present in the plasma, increasing immune tolerance and endometrial receptivity. So this was a good study in its design. It was a negative study. So there was no difference in their primary outcome of live birth, nor in any of their secondary outcomes. I was a little curious as to, this was not really a contemporary data set. It was collected. Patients were enrolled from 2016 to 2021. It's just now being published. And there were some limitations to this study design. So there were a mix of cleavage and blastocyst transfer, and the latter was introduced at this center about halfway through the enrollment period. So there was also a mix of single and double transfer, though it was 80% ESET or single embryo transfer in this cohort. This study, in my opinion, answers the question of whether this particular methodology improves live birth, and it does not. That said, it's not totally clear how clinically useful this particular answer is. It's certainly not something that I'm doing on a regular basis. And the other question is, it doesn't necessarily test whether exposure to semen might be helpful in other applications within ART. So obviously, we wouldn't be putting whole semen into a woman's vagina or encouraging her to have intercourse at the time of oocyte pickup, generally speaking, because of the risk of multiple pregnancy, torsion, you name it. That said, there are other applications, for example, whether we should be advising patients to have sex around the time or in advance of their frozen embryo transfer. And knowing that putting seminal plasma from which the sperm have been removed into the vagina at the time of oocyte pickup for fresh transfer doesn't answer the question of whether there might be some benefit there. Is there a benefit, for example, of a larger volume of semen, of sperm, of orgasm that could potentially improve implantation? So we can't derive from this study, I should say, whether there's any utility to exposure to semen or seminal plasma for improvement of implantation potential. That said, nice study, and does reassure me that I shouldn't be putting half a cc of seminal plasma into my patient's vagina at the time of their retrieval. I'm interested to hear others' thoughts.
I've never been so happy to see a null finding in my life when I read the abstract.
I totally agree. And I mean, patients ask about this a lot. There must be some TikTok or something that's out there that tells patients to have intercourse. And I think what's dangerous about that is the likelihood of multiple pregnancy, and especially the likelihood of heterotopic pregnancy when you have intercourse on top of IVF. And I've seen it more than twice. And so I think this is a really interesting study, a good question, and I'm so glad it was negative.
People really do their best to try to make things as quote unquote natural as possible. But interesting question, but I agree with you guys. It would have changed everything.
I have a statistical question for the group. So in their methods, they didn't talk about logistic regression or regression modeling, but this is an RCT, and Kate sort of described some of the things, but I don't know that, you would hope, I guess, randomly those would be distributed similarly between the two groups. In this case, it wasn't necessarily always, but they seem to have added logistic regression in. I don't know if that was from the reviewers, but just Kurt or Kate, your thoughts on using regression modeling in a randomized trial.
Yeah, I mean, it's they felt it was necessary, or someone did in this study, given the changes that occurred over the study period and some inequality that they found in the data sets. I would have preferred them not to have done it. They also did it and then described that it didn't impact, basically the lack of difference that they found in any way.
Yeah, the dry answer, Micah, is of course, if you think that you didn't get true randomization, you can use regression analysis to fix that. But the right thing to do is to show it both ways, so you don't think you're cherry picking the results or forcing the results in one direction or another. Easy to lie with statistics, but it's easier to lie without them.
I love that.
And they did it both ways, so to their credit.
Yep, exactly. All right, we have one more that I'm going to finish up on. This is a predictive model of miscarriage on the basis of data from a preconception cohort study. This is by Dr. Land and Dr. Wise at Boston University. So essentially, they're in a preconception cohort from the Presto trial. They're following women who had 160 questions answered before they tried to get pregnant, and then over the next 12 months as they attempted to get pregnant. And in this case, they were looking to see if they could make a model that could predict pregnancy loss or miscarriage. And they had, as I said, 160 things that they collected preconceptionally from these patients in a questionnaire format, followed them for 12 months. And they used all the same types of statistics that Kurt talked to us about in the other machine learning model. And they used two different approaches. One was a static approach, at which they just looked at miscarriage or pregnancy loss as a dichotomous outcome, yes or no. The other was in a survival way of looking at data, which is essentially looking at the rate of miscarriage over time in this patient population. So they use those two models and then all the same types that Kurt had talked about. So out of 16,000 patients during this study period, 9,000 of them got pregnant. And out of those 9,000 women, 20.4% had a miscarriage. So 1 in 5, probably about what we would expect from other similar aged patient populations. And then they looked at all of their models, and they had a whole bunch of them, all the ones that Kurt described, plus the static and the survival curves. And Kate or Kurt, do you want to guess what's predictive of miscarriage?
Age.
Yes. So by far the biggest one, the most associated, was the age of the female. And then the second one, which we would also guess would be a history of miscarriage. So having prior miscarriages. Really nothing else fell out as being significant or having much weight throughout all of the ways in which they slice this data, and including looking at sort of early pregnancy loss, mid-pregnancy loss, pregnancy loss after 8 weeks. Those two were really the only consistent ones that showed up. And as Kurt talked about, so there's an association, but sort of what's the final piece is how strong is that association, or how much is this driving the model? And so they used a different statistic. In Kurt's paper, they used the C, or the area under the curve. In this one, they used the F1. The F1 is precision over recall, but the way that we know those two words is positive predictive value over sensitivity. And we can imagine that those two things often are going against each other as you're designing a test. The more patients you detect that have the disease, the more willing you're to opening that up. So you detect everyone, your positive predictive value or your precision is probably going down. So the more a test can do both positive predictive value and sensitivity, the better the F is. So for the F, it's on a scale of 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%. And the closer it is to 100%, the better the F score. In this case, for that model with female age and history of pregnancy loss, the F score was only 73%. So certainly it had some prediction, but it wasn't anywhere near the 90 or 100% range. And they also looked at area under the curve, similar to Kurt's study. And in this case, they were all less than 60%. So as Kurt said, they're somewhere just north of a coin flip. So overall, I like this study. I thought it was great that they had it in a preconception cohort, that they followed them prospectively, that they had 160 different exposures that they were looking at, or predictors that they were looking at. But overall, with this great cohort and all this fancy statistics, we still ended up exactly where we would have. It's the female's age and the history of miscarriage that predicts it, but that prediction is still very low. It's still very hard for us to tell a person that they're going to have a miscarriage, even if they have these risk factors. Most of those pregnancies still end up being normal.
Yeah, so I think the positive spin on it is we really can't predict it. And so when we see that patient who's had a miscarriage, who thinks that she's doomed to have another miscarriage, I think these data can be actually reassuring to say, you know what, there was a large scale study that looked for predictors of miscarriage. And while it was somewhat predictive, it is not entirely predictive. It was poorly predictive. And let's stay optimistic.
In this discussion on prediction, I'm really glad to see that the prediction is coming into the medical literature, but most of these machine learning algorithms are used to basically see what you're going to buy at Walmart. So it's interesting to see that medical prediction is not as good as consumer spending. So we'll get more on this as we go.
Great discussion today. Lots of learning. As always, there are other great articles to read and video articles in the journal, as well as several interesting letters to the editors with replies from the authors if you'd like to read that. As always, please like and subscribe to this podcast and listen to all of the other podcasts from our sister journal and the seminal article each month. Kurt, Kate, Eve, we'll see you in August.
A shout out to the people that said hello to me at the Aspire meeting. I'm glad to hear that our podcast is reaching the entire world.
And we are recording this the day after Father's Day. So a shout out to all the fathers out there, and everybody join in again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
This concludes our episode of Fertility and Sterility on Air, brought to you by Fertility and Sterility in conjunction with the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. This podcast is produced by Dr. Molly Cornfield and Dr. Adriana Wong. This podcast was developed by Fertility and Sterility and the American Society for Reproductive Medicine as an educational resource and service to its members and other practicing clinicians. While the podcast reflects the views of the authors and the hosts, it is not intended to be the only approved standard of practice or to direct an exclusive course of treatment. The opinions expressed are those of the discussants and do not reflect Fertility and Sterility or the American Society for Reproductive Medicine.